welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories, but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Podcasts share their career-defining drug, song and book, and also share their joyful patient stories.
Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. For this episode, we're joined by Louise Trewern. Louise is lived experience advocate, a lived experience lead trainer and past vice chair at the British Pain Society Patient Voice Committee, as well as a successful chronic pain manager. We will welcome Louise in a moment as she shares a drug for our formulary, her career anthem, and recommends a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. For our micro discussion, it's still the Sunday Times article, "The NHS is flatlining, here's how to save it right now." We're nearly there, folks. Our Oral Apothecary NHS Tonic will be in the shop soon. But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both.
Evening.
Evening.
What have you been up to?
Well, I think I mentioned it earlier, but I've experienced the NHS from the wrong side, I suppose, last couple of weeks. My dad had a stroke 2 weeks ago. We're on holiday. Well, he was on holiday in North Wales, so had a stroke. So that's not been great. He's okay though. And then my mother-in-law had a fall and has fractured neck of femur. So experiencing all ends of the NHS the last couple of weeks. But I don't want to dwell on that. I wanted to read out this from my mum, who you know is a listener. So here we go.
Number one listener.
If anyone criticises Welsh NHS again, just tell them to visit Gwynedd Stroke Unit. State of cleanliness, tailored care, proper personal care, lovely staff, free parking and a canteen that kept me fed for a week for the cost of one restaurant meal. Oh, and an excellent physio. So big thanks to the stroke ward Priester, I think, up in Ysbyty Gwynedd. So thank you very much if any of our listeners are up there. Jamie, I was with your friend Louise Lethbridge.
Sarah Lethbridge.
Sarah Lethbridge. I was looking at Louise's name on the screen. And Sarah Lethbridge, this morning we were doing a lean methodology workshop with our haematology team. So that was good. Lots of solid improvement ideas coming out of that. And we talked about our favourite term, which was failure demand. So I got to talk about our GP work again.
So, hey, look, it's not just thrown together. I was on my fourth webinar yesterday, which was being hosted by Q, the health. Was
this the John Seddon one yesterday?
Well, John Seddon wasn't there, but it was being chaired by one of our guests, GP Ben Allen from Sheffield. So it was the Q community, and it was somebody from Vanguard, which is the company of John Seddon. And so I was very interested in it because it was about looking at systems within primary care. And there was one slide in particular that I loved, and you might know this already, Gimmo. So when they started mapping what they were looking at using the Vanguard technique, the person who was the lead clinician was told that there were only 3 rules to start with, okay? One was do no harm. Second one was don't break the law. And the third one was don't change the IT yet.
Okay.
Have you heard that before? I thought that was really good.
I've heard the do no harm bit.
So, yeah, very complicated, but clearly, as we all love a bit of failure demand and value demand.
Safe to fail we use. That's what I use.
Okay, yeah. And I've also been doing, as ever, lots of teaching around polypharmacy and my favourite subject, single organologists. And the new one in the teaching the last couple of weeks was somebody, not me, I think it was one of the geriatricians said, we do have to watch out for the single organologist halo, which I like.
So is that your phrase entering the lexicon then, is it?
That's entering the lexicon, indeed, yes. Jane, what have you been up to?
Well, I've just this minute got back, really. So I finished in North Wales at 4 o'clock this afternoon, just ran a public workshop, had 40 members of the public on shared decision-making, single organologists, and a whole raft of other things around medicines. And so it was great. And then yesterday I was in North Wales as well, running a workshop for healthcare professionals with the help of 2 actors. So we did some forum theatre yesterday. Have you done any forum theatre, Gimmo?
Yeah.
Yeah, very clever and very useful.
Do you mean the improvisation stuff?
Yeah, very very clever and very useful technique for going through things like communication skills and having difficult conversations and trying to have influencing conversations. So yeah, great 2 days, but only literally just got back now.
Did you do yes and yes but?
No, we didn't do that. We didn't get into that type of improv. But
Well, good commitment to the pod tonight.
yeah, and the folk of Flintshire really enjoyed the session, and I hope by now they will be well into the oral apothecary.
Listening in order, obviously.
Indeed. Okay, let's move on. It's our great pleasure to welcome Louise to the oral apothecary. Louise uses the experience she had since childhood to help others who are struggling with chronic pain. Louise's story started with pain in childhood that often was unexplained medically despite repeated appointments and investigations. Later she discovered it was fibromyalgia. But it was the opioids, she says, that took everything to another level. Welcome to the podcast, Louise.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thank you. Look, so if we bumped into you in a pub, a bar or a coffee house, Louise, what would your story be?
Wow. So do you want me to start right at the very beginning?
Go on.
I mean, I as you said, I've had pain all my life. And, you know, I remember my mum saying that she used to take me to the doctors as a small child because I used to have pain in my arms and my legs. And the doctor used to say, oh, it's fine, it's just growing pains. You know, she'll grow out of it as she gets older. Well, I never did. You know, and it just sort of progressed as I got older. It wasn't constant back then, but it was always a feature, along with other weird and wonderful things. So I had chest infection after chest infection. I remember always being on the very delicious antibiotic penicillin liquid. And I loved it. I really loved it. It tasted nice. But no, I was quite poorly in all seriousness. And, you know, I can remember the doctor at that time paying home visits to come and see me. In the winter, I would be in bed with a really bad chest infection that back then I was told was bronchitis, and in later life that was ruled out by x-rays and things. And he would come in and throw open all the windows wide and say, you need to get some air in here. But yeah, I was really sickly. I didn't take part in sport at school, which of course sort of singled me out as well, because the other kids thought, oh, you know, it's Louise, she doesn't do any sport. So, you know, when it came to, you know, the old thing where it's picking teams, I was always the last one to be picked because, you know, I was rubbish really, because I hardly ever did it. But that, whilst I can laugh about it now, at the time used to make me feel pretty awful, to be fair. So I got used to it. I was good at some things. I was good at things that where I could stand still. So I was quite good at things like the shot put, and I was quite good. Actually, I was quite good at the long jump initially, because that wasn't too bad. I could just take a run up and jump. That was great. But anything else, nah, rubbish. So I constantly had this bad chest, and I suppose that was about it until I got much older. Those things kept recurring: the pain, the arms and legs, and this chest infection on and off, bad colds. And I also, funnily enough, I also remember back then in school, which I didn't think too much of at the time, having crippling periods once they started it at high school. And this is important because of what happened later on. And it would be so bad that I would either stop off at my grand's house, because I would get the bus from Teignmouth to King Stainton, and my gran lived right opposite the bus stop. And I would get off the bus in floods of tears, not really understanding why I was in such distress. Go into my gran's, and she knew exactly what was going on, and she would keep me there. And so my mum would turn up later on the bus to get shopping and stuff, and see my gran and find me there and tell her off for keeping me off school. But, you know, I was really grateful because it was really, really bad. It just compounded everything else. I felt really depressed, didn't understand why. At this time, I suppose I'm getting up to about 15, just before leaving school, when this is all happening.
Any medicines involved at this point?
Not at this point. No, not at all then. No. Apart from the antibiotics when the chest infection got really bad. It's still, they're telling my mum that it's bronchitis, which actually I don't know that I've heard of nowadays much. Anyway, that was then. So fast forward a bit, left school, started working as a care assistant, and things were all right on and off for a little while, and then other weird things started creeping in, like they thought I had some funny, I can only describe it as funny dizzy spells. And when I went to the doctor, they thought it was a condition called Meniere's disease. Actually, I go back a bit. Before that, they thought it was a mini stroke that I'd had. Because I was sat in a chair at home, and all of a sudden I started having weird visual disturbances, and I could only see right in front of me. I felt like I needed to hold on to the armchair, like I was going to fall off, and it was just hideous. Went to the doctors, and that was what he thought, but later decided, actually, don't think it's that, I think it's Meniere's. All of which never ever really got a definitive diagnosis, and I think this is common with people with fibromyalgia especially.
So when did that diagnosis come?
Didn't come until a few years later, when it happened again. And I think for the Meniere's, I went into hospital for some tests, and they did all the things, like I seem to recall having water poured in my ears, and my head shook about and turned upside down, and all these lovely things, which were actually really awful at the time. But when the diagnosis came back, it was always either inconclusive or borderline, and that was, I don't know which one Meniere's became, but the point of it was, though, that the drug that they used to help an attack of Meniere's did seem to help to an extent, but they couldn't actually say 100% you have Meniere's.
This being a medicines podcast, what can you remember what medicine that was?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would if I heard it.
Oh, we're bringing a resident clinician now. He's itching.
Was it beta histine or
Yes.
Circ?
Circ.
That was going to be my guess.
Yeah.
Circ.
Well, it's the same. It's the same thing.
So my son had a sort of vestibular disorder and never really got it nailed down. And Steve often sort of goes off on one about single organologists, but actually the system's not designed, is it, for those nondescript? I mean, that's why fibromyalgia. So I don't know much about it, but my understanding is it's almost defined by its lack of
Yes.
when you've ruled everything else out, isn't it?
Yes.
There's no actual clear diagnosis, and the NHS doesn't deal with that very well, does it?
They call it, don't they, a disease of exclusion.
Yeah.
Because you have to go through, and I mean, I'm not kidding. Over on the cupboard there, I've got 10 years worth of notes, but my hospital notes, when they come out, are sort of huge, great files, because of all the tests and things that I've been sent for over the years. I think when you're sent for these tests, what healthcare professionals, I think, don't realise is that this, for someone like me, who's been going through this for years, while that test it's been done, you don't know the answer, you are waiting there on tenterhooks, wanting to, thinking, oh, well, they've told me they think it might be this. Yeah, what if it's this? Even though you're told not to, you research it and you find out all the worst possible scenarios, for it then to come back and you be told, well, actually, we're not quite sure. It might be. It might not be.
So, Louise, I know you said at the beginning, and I've heard you speak before, about not wanting to lay blame at anyone's door, and I think that's very good of you to say that, because I think we can't learn unless we listen to things that have gone wrong, because we're all human and we all make mistakes, and we don't know everything. But on reflection, do you think it's what led up to this, and then the diagnosis of fibromyalgia, and the fact that you didn't fit into any nice, neat boxes? Do you think that's what started the journey of coming to the painkillers? Is that what, in your mind, is that what really kicked it off?
I don't know, actually. With the benefit of what I've learned in the last 6 years, since coming off the opioids, I've got a different view now. And I sort of think, I believe there is a lot to be said for the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and a lot to be said for, the trauma that you suffer and you think you've dealt with, because when I look back, I can reel them off, and so I do think that added to everything else. And I think the lack of diagnosis, the fear around, oh my God, they think it's, because, I have to say, a couple of the really, really frightening ones were when I would suddenly have really, really bad chest pain that I could barely breathe, and ambulances were called. I've been taken in, even the ambulance crew think it's a heart attack. So they rig me up to everything and do all that they do to ward that off as best they can while they get you into hospital. All the time, everything's being, not confirmed, but it's looking that way. They get you into hospital, they start running even more tests, and sort of 24 hours later, they say, well, actually, it wasn't a heart attack, but we're not really sure what it was. So all that really piles up on you.
Yeah. No, I think it's really good that you've sort of talked us and the listener through the complexity of where we got to, or where you got to. So if we then wind forward, where at what point were you on the most amount of painkillers, in particular, perhaps opiates, the morphine-based medicines, and then so talk us from there. What happened then? What was your worst, and then how did the journey start to unpick some of that?
Before you do, Louise, can I just check with STC? Are you referring to them as painkillers because you're going back in time and it was of its moment, or are you just misspeaking there?
Well,
painkillers, it's a hideous term.
I think that I used this before, and I've said that painkillers are an oxymoron, haven't I?
And do you know what? I have to say, I have argued when I worked with Torbay Pain Service to develop the patient information. No, it wasn't a leaflet. It was a leaflet. I argued for the inclusion of the word painkillers, even though the other members of the team didn't want it because they don't exist. But my argument was that it's what the public at large recognise.
Yeah.
Painkillers.
Thank
We
you.
all know there's no such thing, but that's what the public knows. But that's not to say we shouldn't try.
Well, we've got to start somewhere, haven't we, Louise? We've got to start somewhere. One starfish at a time.
I'm thinking of our lay listeners, okay? But anyway, so what was the worst? Where did you get to? What was the worst amount of medication that you were taking to help you with your pain and your surrounding conditions?
Yeah. Well, I suppose where medication really started playing a part, after my fourth child was born, this business with the periods and such like got worse and worse, to the point where I was taking a lot of time off work, more or less every month. So sort of every period I would end up having some time off work because it was unbearable. Pain like I'd never experienced before. And I would take the usual drugs they recommend for period pain, but it didn't really help. It certainly didn't help enough to work. So after I had my fourth child, I asked if I could have a hysterectomy. And because I'd got 4 children, even though I was quite young, I was only, I think I was around 32, 33 at the time, they agreed. And they suspected that there was probably more going on than we realised. And I had sort of convinced myself that I must have something awful like cancer or something like that going on for all this pain. It was just incredibly bad. After I'd had the hysterectomy, I was waiting again with bated breath and fear for the histology to come back. And when it finally did come back, I was told that they were absolutely amazed. There was nothing at all obvious as to why I should have needed that hysterectomy. Nothing. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, on the one hand, I was relieved, But on the other hand, it sort of makes you feel like you're a liar. You know, you couldn't have possibly been in all that pain when there's nothing wrong with you, which was sort of the story of my life, really. So anyway, fast forward to that. You're told it's going to take you maybe a year to get over a hysterectomy properly, 6 months before you can really start doing stuff again. I think it was after about 3 or 4 months, I tried to return to work as a night care assistant in a home, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't stay awake. I couldn't do the job properly. So that was when I gave up. And that's when depression set in, and they started with antidepressants. And I remember the first one they gave me was Prozac, and I couldn't bear it. I couldn't tolerate it at all. I was ringing the surgery in floods of tears that I literally couldn't stop. And they changed it. But that was where I think the pain started really kicking in on a regular basis. So I don't think I ever really got over the hysterectomy properly.
So you would attribute the increasing pain due to your mental health condition?
I mean, now, with hindsight, yes, definitely. It definitely, I think, played a part. And of course, when I look back at all the things that happened in my childhood leading up to it, emotional traumas, there's loads. There's loads. But of course, this is all now with hindsight. It's easy to figure it out.
Yeah, but these stories are intended to help people, aren't they?
Yeah.
To understand that even if they don't think there's a backstory, maybe there is a backstory that they've not considered.
And I mean, it's amazing now. I'll talk to people and say about, how I really think there's a lot about trauma-informed care. I think it's really important. And they'll say, well, yeah, that's fair enough, but, I haven't had any trauma in my life. And then they'll tell you something, in the next breath that clearly is traumatic, but they just don't think it is. So I'm not saying it's the same for everybody, but I think it certainly is for a lot of people. And we assume we've dealt with this stuff, and we haven't at all.
There's a lot of work been done in Public Health Wales on this, on ACEs, adverse childhood events, and you can attribute it to something like smoking or the cumulative effect of it on your long-term health is it's similar to, I don't know, being obese or smoking or air pollution in terms of the impact it has on your long-term health. It's not just psychological. The effects affect your physical health as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm certainly no big advocate for everybody acknowledging what's going on in their life and not suppressing anything, because I think that's a huge part of it as well. And I think especially for men, I mean, we know men are the worst maybe for acknowledging what's going on, especially emotionally.
Yep.
And talking to people. So yeah, I mean, so if I go back to the story, sort of after this, I moved house. I had split up with my husband. I had met a woman. So this is still all piling on the emotional stuff. 4 kids to look after. Eventually I move house, and then my mum dies, who's my rock. And I found her along with my sister-in-law, which was really, I think, the next big catalyst, because I didn't deal with that very well at all. And again, with hindsight, I can now see that that's when, again, pain got really quite bad. And yeah, so the thing that led to strong pain medications was my back locking up one morning. I woke up one morning and I couldn't move, literally couldn't move. My back had locked up completely, and I really was in that moment terrified that I was paralysed. I needed to get up, sort the children out, and I couldn't. The only way I was able to move was by very, very gently sort of trying to wriggle until there was enough movement there to throw myself onto my side and wriggle some more and gradually free it up enough to get out of bed. But I mean, it was absolute pure agony. Once I was up and moving, it wasn't too bad, but it felt like my lower back was, something really nasty had happened. So after this had happened a few times, I went to the doctor, to the GP, and he prescribed some anti-inflammatories initially, and paracetamol, and put me on a list to see a visiting orthopaedic surgeon that was coming to the surgery. But it didn't work. Those medications didn't work at all, because, of course, while I was up and moving, I didn't have any pain, really. It was when I went to bed and woke up the next morning that I felt this excruciating pain. So what could he give me that would still be working the next morning? And this is where opioids come into the picture.
So what medicines are you on at this point, Louise? How many?
At the moment, or in the story?
No, in the story.
In the story, he introduced the old MST morphine tablet.
And then prior to that, though, you've tried some anti-inflammatories. You've got
anti-inflammatories, paracetamol,
antidepressants still going.
Yeah. And I can't remember which one it was back then, but the antidepressants stayed right until 6 years ago. Well, it's still there now because there's one I still can't taper. And I think as well, somewhere along the line, they put in a liquid that was meant to help you sleep, but apparently was also quite good for pain. But I don't know when that one came in, and I can't remember the name of it now. You used to have to draw it up in a little syringy thing.
What, laudanum, was it?
Wow.
Chloral hydrate.
I was going to say, was it chloral hydrate?
Okay, so the morphine sulfate comes in the MST, yeah.
So yeah, and then that initially that was blooming fantastic. You know, I got to say, in the beginning, it was fabulous. It solved the problem. I didn't have this pain every morning anymore. As long as I kept taking these pills, I was great. I could look after the kids. I could go to work. I was fine. Not work, sorry, I wasn't working. But anyway, of course, over the time, it had to keep being increased to keep working. And every time it started to wear off, I assumed my problem was getting worse. In the meantime, I'd seen this visiting orthopaedic surgeon, and he had felt all the way down my spine and said I'd got a problem with my discs between L4 and L5. And that was really basically all I heard there. Degenerative disc, that was it. And so to carry on with the medication, which I did. Now, all this time, mind, there's never been any mention of anything else that I could do. So nobody said, you need to be doing this type of exercise, or you need to be doing this. Nothing else. Then there was the day I went to the GP for something else. Stop the story there a second. In the meantime, all through this picture, the other thing I've got going on, which was diagnosed, was a thing called hidradenitis suppurativa. Have you heard of this? So it's where you get boils and lesions in different places, usually in places that are really painful, under the arms, in the groin, really nasty. Now, while I was growing up, there was the odd one or two. Once opioids started getting introduced, they became quite prevalent, really. But I didn't join the dots on that, and neither did anybody else for a long time. Anyway, so I went to the doctor for probably for something to do with that, or another chest infection, or some other kind of infection I was getting. And he said, Louise, we've had a visit from a rep. And we've got to change everybody off MST onto this fantastic new drug, OxyContin. And the best thing about it is you live with chronic pain, so you can't become addicted.
Welcome to the Sackler family. I think we should say at this point, if you haven't seen Dope Sick, any listener, this is what you need to be watching. This was the nuts and bolts of the marketing campaign.
Louise, how confident are you that that's exactly how it happened?
How do you mean?
Controversial.
Well, you know, that conversation around there's been a rep in. You can remember that language. Back.
Yeah. No, I totally believe it. And I also actually believe that my GP believed it.
Well, I was going to say that was the narrative we were taught, wasn't it? I mean,
it was.
To be fair to that GP, that was the
absolutely
generally considered thing that if you had chronic pain,
You couldn't be
you
addicted.
wouldn't. Well, it wasn't quite that, but it wasn't far off what we were taught, was it, Steve? We roughly.
No. The teaching was if you've got malignant pain that you couldn't get addicted. So no, this was a fallacy. This was bad pharma at its very baddest. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. But remember, at its worst, 100,000 deaths a year in the US associated with this. I mean, I say we probably just draw a line there and say go and watch Dope Sick if you've not seen it. So Louise, things then escalated big time, didn't they? And you got up to massive doses. If I remember right, you got up to like 300, the equivalent of 300 milligram a day of morphine. Is that right?
Yeah, with all of it added together, and it was just unreal. Two different antidepressants. Codeine on top of that, diazepam, all this stuff, which I totally believed I needed. And I just want to stop actually, and I know we've already said it, but I want to say it again. I do not blame any healthcare professional that has been involved in my care over the years, because what you were saying at the beginning about GPs, all healthcare professionals, I assume, sign up saying, that they're not going to do any harm. And I don't think anybody does, apart from the odd weirdo, sign
Harold
up
Shipman.
to hurt people. That's not the idea. I could have done things differently as well. And it just happened. And that's why I do what I do, so that people can learn from it. All of us, including, people that live with pain.
Absolutely. Yeah, so you're on this huge cocktail of things. And again, just for the listener, the guidance now is that if you're on more than the equivalent of 120 milligrams of morphine, that is absolutely clear that there is no benefit to being on more than that. And it may not work anyway, but you're certainly more than that. All you're getting is side effect, not effect. And I think that's what happened with you, isn't it? And then what was the trigger then? What was the trigger? So it's been really helpful and interesting to hear about how you got there. But what was the trigger point that then you went, whoa, hang on a minute, this can't continue, this is a problem?
So all the time I'm on this stuff, gradually my health is deteriorating. And the trouble is, this stuff is so insidious. You don't join the dots. It's so slow. You assume as a person experiencing it that your health is getting worse. Your condition, in my case, fibromyalgia and osteoarthritis, are getting worse. And so you must need more and more drugs. And that's all you understand. So my mobility was getting worse. I was piling on weight despite trying to do things to stop that. And ended up 25 stone, at my worst, 25 stone, living in the armchair, not really seeing anybody. I wouldn't answer the phone. I didn't want any music, any noise. Everything had to be quiet. I was absolutely sensitive, oversensitive, ultra sensitive to everything, to every kind of stimulus. The cat walking across my lap was excruciating. And therefore, by association, my wife, who became my full-time carer, her life was limited as well, because she was taking care of me the whole time. And we really didn't see, people stop asking you to do things in the family because they know you're going to say no, or I don't know. So at this point, I've got grandchildren, but I'm not really spending that much time with them because even though I argued the opposite, I was just like a zombie.
So what changed the course of history?
So I went back to the doctors again for yet another, to beg for more, because that's what I thought I needed, because I was in so much pain, and I would be there in tears. And fortunately, he had reached the absolute limit of what he could prescribe in primary care, so referred me back to the pain clinic, where I hadn't been for years. And I met the most wonderful clinical nurse specialist called Dee Burrows. That was where the turnaround started. She was the first person that ever suggested that actually the problem wasn't my condition getting worse. It was the side effects of long-term use of opiates, which, when we used to go together, myself and my wife, because I didn't trust myself to remember everything in any healthcare appointment. And when she first started telling me this stuff, I thought, bloody woman, what does she know? It's how ridiculous that she started to suggest that my life could be better if I could reduce or even stop these meds. And I thought she was talking out of her behind, to be fair. And she knows this. We're great friends nowadays. And she's heard me tell this story a million times now. But she persevered, and she just calmly kept repeating this thing. And at the same time, she backed it up by showing me the page on Faculty of Pain Medicine, Opioids Aware, where all the side effects of long-term use are listed. And I couldn't argue with what was in black and white. It was there. Everything I was experiencing was there.
You had all of them.
Actually, I didn't mention, I used to CD every, I don't know what it was now, maybe 6-8 weeks. And she would start teaching me self-management things that I could do. She showed me a pain workbook that sadly I can't remember the name of, but initially I didn't like anyway.
At what point then did you suddenly think, oh, this isn't a load of rubbish, she's actually right?
So whilst I'm seeing her in clinic, which I think on the whole, before I went into hospital, this must have been over the course of maybe a year, every so many weeks that you get your appointment. And in that time, I suffered 2 emergency admissions to Torbay with opioid-induced impaction, which came out of the blue. Because I was on opiates, I was taking a sachet of laxative every morning to supposedly prevent this happening. And I was going to the toilet. There wasn't an issue. I didn't think there was an issue. But one Friday night I went to go to the toilet and I just couldn't go. And then this continued over the weekend. And in the course of the weekend, I had visits from on-call GP, district nurse, paramedic, again and again, until Monday morning an ambulance was called and off I went to hospital and into theatre. And this happened twice in fairly quick succession. And the second time, I remember distinctly, the second time I went in, I wanted to crawl under a stone and die. And I mean, the pain was off the scale, let alone the embarrassment and everything else. And the theatre technicians, in a bid to try and reassure me, and I know that's what they were trying to do, said, "Don't worry, my love, we see this all the time with people on opioids." And that was supposed to reassure me, but I was horrified. I was literally horrified. And I thought, right, that's it. You are not seeing me again. And I went back to Dee at the next appointment and I said, right, you need to get me off this stuff before it kills me. I'd also developed in that time severe sleep apnea as well, which was picked up quite by accident by an astute physiotherapist that I was seeing for something else, and was on a full face machine. I was in a bad way.
So it was the severe constipation that required so bad that I had to go to theatre to have it, evacuated, as it were. That was the trigger that then made you the best of friends with Dee, this physio.
Yes.
And then you slowly came on board with, and I'm sure you've listened to the Tracy Brown episode that we did previously about pain management. And I think, although it's quite some story you've got, the point is that there is a backstory nearly always, and it's being able to unpick that. But even if you think you've asked the right question, you're probably not going to open up until you trust somebody. And I'm going to guess that what you've now got is a trusting relationship between you and this nurse. Was it, are they a nurse or a physio practitioner?
Yeah, clinical nurse specialist.
And then the journey basically went on. And, I guess in the interest of time, you ended up, as I understand it, you actually went through a rapid taper, didn't you? Which we're not, it's not done that frequently, but you were under hospital supervision. You went through rapid reduction, which a lot of people don't get the benefit of, in inverted commas. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but it meant that you then were accelerated down to, and then your journey, I'm assuming you took it on yourself then, didn't you? And you did all the things that you needed to do.
I think they slashed it in half on the first night, in half again on the third night. And I came out of hospital on something like 10 or 20 milligrams plus some clonidine to back it up short term. And over the course of the next month, I stopped the rest of it. And no, it wasn't pretty, but my goodness, compared to, doing it slowly in the community, I wish everyone could go in and come off it like that.
Yeah. And now you spend your time, I know you spend a huge amount of time, don't you, talking about your story, but trying to help others to understand and to signpost people to things like Flipping Pain. And there are lots of really good websites, aren't there, and lots of resources now to try and get people to engage with this concept. But you've still got to get people over the line, haven't you?
And I mean, so my biggest thing is the work I do. Flipping Pain is amazing, and getting the awareness out there. And my love is with the website and the people that run Live Well with Pain, which is run by Dr. Francis Cole and Dr. Emma Davis. And it's a not-for-profit. And I originally got to know them when Francis came down from Yorkshire with their webman and cameraman, David Andrassy, to film my story, which sits on the website, and that of my wife as a carer. And both of those films are on the website. And, since that time, I started getting involved with other stuff, public speaking, British Pain Society, and so on and so forth, until now I'm at the stage where, there's the organisations that stay true to my heart that I will stay involved with as long as I can, like the Physiotherapy Pain Association, PPA, and Live Well with Pain and Flipping Pain and the British Pain Society. All those places, they're all fantastic, and there's lots of resources. But now at Live Well, I've become the lead lived experience trainer for this new training that we're doing, which I think is groundbreaking. It's us, it's a team of lived experience people that have been through similar things and managing to be, take that back, are now successful self-managers, along with clinicians that work in the field of pain, psychologists and other professionals, delivering this training online together as a team. And it's 12 hours of training, and it's for GPs, social prescribers, anybody really, physiotherapists, pharmacists. Yeah. All these people, largely in primary care, I think, because the aim is to try and help as many people as possible stay out of the pain clinics and off the, out of the revolving door system.
And that's the article. I mean, you shared that article with us on WhatsApp, didn't you, Steve, a couple of days ago? And that was, I'm not sure if it's the same thing we're talking about, but essentially what that was saying is that multidisciplinary approach, recognising that it's a complex, multifaceted, not easy to explain issue is and that's the paradigm, or that's the shift change we've got to get over is I would imagine that people are coming on board with this. We're talking about this more even in the last couple of years, but still there's a temptation, isn't there, to attribute a physical cause to pain. But what you've demonstrated, I mean, we've probably heard a tenth of your story, that there is all these things that feed into it, and there is no easy explanation, and we've got to approach it from this complex angle.
Because there is no one size fits all. It's not like other areas of healthcare, is it? Things like diabetes and all those things. My pain is different to your pain, and therefore will need different types of treatment.
Not for now, but maybe with our final guest of this series, maybe we can discuss does one size fit all work for any condition? Yeah. Okay, but we won't get into that now. But what you just said is a term I'd not heard before, and I saw Jamie's eyebrows go up, I think, because I think he liked it as well, and it fits with what our first patient on this series said, which was about people becoming project managers for their own health. And you used a term that I've never heard before, which I've written down, that you classify yourself as a successful self-manager. I love that.
Yeah.
Have you heard that before, James?
No, only in Louise's bio.
Oh, right, okay. But it's great. It's great, isn't it? It's really, it's testament to what you're talking about, and the point that us as people who are learned experience need to realise that people with lived experience are just they're different, aren't they? They've got a different form of experience, but we have to treat it in the same way. Well, not in the same way, but we have to give it equal respect to the learned experience. And that's what shared decision making and all the people that we've ever had on here talking about how to get to the point, which isn't easy, and nobody's saying it's easy. But for something as complex as chronic long-term pain of non-malignant nature, that is essentially where you've got to get to, isn't it? And so all this great stuff that you do, and we'll put in the show notes, but you also, I think, are big in this idea of Pain Cafe and trying to do walking with people to talk about things while you're actually exercising, which helps itself and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So I'm an ambassador for Ramblers and their wellbeing walks. I lead 2 wellbeing walks in Payton and Decoy Park in Newton Abbot, along with my wife, Karen. And also an ambassador for Active Devon and all this. And yeah, I believe strongly in getting out there and connecting actively with nature. And in the first year off opioids, we walked every single day. I started with a wheelie walker and progressed on through to not needing any aids at all. And I always say to people, if all you can do today is just get to your garden gate, if that's more than you did yesterday, then that's blimmin' fantastic. And just slowly work on that, build it up.
Can I just say, I don't want to make you blush, but when there's been all this stuff in the news about all the rubbish about Boris Johnson giving out honours to people who've done diddly squat, it's people like you who have, committed themselves to trying to do better for others. I think that's the sort of people you want in your honours list. And I don't want to make you blush, but it's that level of commitment that you're up to.
What, over Rees-Mogg?
Yeah, exactly.
Recently, I was asked to run the 10 footsteps, which is Live Well with Pain is the 10 footsteps to living well with pain and all the associated resources within that. And I was asked to put on a local group in Totnes, and they turned it into a lunch club. And I'd never done it before, so I sort of tentatively agreed whilst pointing out that I'm not an expert, although now I believe I am. These people have been absolutely blown away by the content they've learned, and they had a free lunch at the same time. And all I did was go through the 10 footsteps on the Live Well with Pain website, and we discussed it as a group. And that is, I think, the main basis of a pain cafe. But I know it's important, Francis will not forgive me if I don't point out, that you can't just have a group that meets and talks about this stuff. You need to have a well-structured group that is going to have other things in there as well. Things where people can learn how to otherwise deal with their pain. Tai Chi, other types of movement, all this kind of thing. But you're right, the multidisciplinary is what's needed. It's complex. And the thing I want to say to healthcare professionals is you've got to also remember that the biggest factor is fear. People are scared to death by the pain and by the prospect of maybe having to come off their drugs. And you need to give them something else first. And I think the main bit they need is the basic pain science education.
The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
Okay, so fabulous, Louise. I think we probably really could talk not just all night, all week. But we can't. So in the interest of time, we're going to move on, although we might come back to some of this subject later, I guess. So there are 3 things as a guest on the Oral Apothecary. I'm sure you're aware of this. And the first is to give us your desert island drug, so a medication that evokes a powerful memory for you. So what is it?
Well, it's got to be OxyContin, because it nearly killed me and I survived it.
That's a great reason.
It is, absolutely. And I'll tell you the other thing. I mean, I said I didn't want to make you blush, but put it like this. Anybody that's prepared to get up and tell people that they had to go to theatre to be manually evacuated is prepared to really give the truth of what it is that you've got to get behind. So I really respect you for that. Okay, OxyContin it is. And the next thing is, what would you like to offer as something for the Oral Apothecary playlist, which is the track, if you like, of your life or perhaps your health journey? It's up to you.
Yeah, am I allowed to explain a little bit behind it?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Yeah, so while I was in hospital on this rapid taper, obviously I couldn't sleep. I was all over the place, so I was scrolling Facebook and came across a group called the Delays, an indie band from, I believe, Southampton. And the reason it was on Facebook was because the woman, the wife of the lead singer, Greg, had posted up about his terminal cancer diagnosis. And so I started investigating. She was raising money, or they were raising money for him by re-releasing Valentine, which is one of their hits. But I found the rest of their music and an album called Faded Seaside Glamour and a particular hit called Wanderlust. And their music, I listened to every single album whilst I was in hospital, and it still remains really, really powerful to me. It helped me through that phase. I contacted them afterwards and explained how powerful I thought it was, and I got in touch with Greg through Twitter. And I was heartbroken to discover last year that he lost his fight in the end. But yeah, their music still plays a big part in my life. So
okay,
yeah.
Well, it's a great story. I am a big music fan, as is Gimmo, not Jamie so much. But it sounds like a Six Music kind of band. But I've actually never heard of them. But I've just looked it up on Spotify, and they're local. They're from the south, yeah. So they're called Delays, and the track you've picked is Wanderlust. Okay, excellent. And the third thing is a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. What would you like to offer?
Yeah, I mean, that was difficult because there are so many great books. But I think one I want to highlight is one by a fellow advocate called Tim Atkinson. And he's also on our Live Well with Pain lived experience team. And he wrote a book called Where Does It Hurt? And I believe it's self-published. I was lucky enough to be sent a copy by him. And it's a memoir of life with chronic pain. And he was also really lucky, I think, to get a foreword written by Lorimer Moseley. You know, he wrote a very nice piece saying that the true experts when it comes to understanding the problem of persistent pain and its impact and potential solutions are those challenged by it. And this book is written by one such expert. And he's got some stuff in there, some really funny stuff, and he talks to all sorts of people. And one of the things I remember that stick in my mind from it is where he says the word patient. He hates the word patient because that's what we do as patients. We sit in waiting rooms all over the country being patient. But it was a great book.
Okay, so Tim Atkinson, Where Does It Hurt? Life with Chronic Pain, a memoir. Just looked it up. Looks interesting. Yeah, okay, we'll put all these in. They will go in the show notes, but also we'll put this all up on the website. So that sounds like a great 3 picks there, Louise. Thank you so much. Lots of thought gone into that.
Okay, micro discussion next. Looking at the recent article, not so recent, in the Sunday Times. The NHS is flatlining. Here's how to save it right now. So, Louise, so far from our oral apothecary guests, we've had ingredients for our NHS 2023 tonic. Are you aware of what we've had so far?
I can't remember. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Fog.
Have you got them there, James?
I've got some of them. You chip
Yeah,
in. So Graham has gone with support, then trust patients as project managers for their own health. I'm guessing there's a huge component in your story with being a project manager and as you said, your wife, who supported you all the way through as well. Treat the person, not the condition, from Deborah Duval. All decisions should be shared, from Alf Collins. Communicate with patients better, from Rachel Power. Utilise community pharmacists more, from Trevor Sylvester. Treat mental health as seriously as physical health, from Liz O'Riordan. Manage the child to adult services journey better for children with long-term conditions, from Louise Jenkins. And it's interesting that your story started all the way back in childhood. Help me out, STC. What was that?
Paul gave us better support NHS organisations to adopt evidence-based improvements in patient care. And we've got one that was given by 2 people, both Graham and Liz, which is analyse health data more to work out what works and what doesn't. I think there are probably overtones to a lot of what Louise has talked about. So you can have a similar one, Louise, but what one thing from your journey and your role perhaps now in other people's lives would you like to offer for the Oral Apothecary NHS 2023 tonic?
It's a really, really tricky one, but you know, I'm really tired of all the committees and things that are set up for people like us to help out. But then when it comes to actually being useful, there's no money. There's never any money. There's plenty of money to spend on drugs. There's plenty of money to spend on other things that we know aren't really that effective. But when it actually comes to this business of, the stuff I could do to help the local hospital, etc. But there's no money for that, and I'm not qualified, which is tosh in my view.
So you're sort of talking about the volunteer. That's called the third sector, isn't it? You're part of the third sector at the minute, which is considered to be voluntary. I think that's your point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that the NHS is relying on people like you, and actually what you're saying is, and I get what you're saying, is that it's a bit like, why does an air ambulance not get any funding, right? Or a hospice doesn't get any funding, and yet we, potentially we still need them. And so I think that's your point, isn't it? Is that if, in particular in pain, if it's so important to get your lived experience part, then there should be some funding for that, which is almost in this idea of top slicing some of the drug budget that might be saved to pay for it.
You need to forward plan a bit, don't you? Which I think the NHS is really bad at doing. And, there are so many of people like me, maybe not as vocal, but there are people like me all over the country that could help their local NHS by helping other people. But they shouldn't be expected to do it for nothing.
You're slipping into a bit of blame there, Louise. Okay, just wind that back a bit, eh?
Oh, darn!
He's only joshing.
I don't know how I would articulate this to Tonic, but the way I'm seeing this is, so we still have a health service that's not a million miles away from, what Anaya and Bevan created, which is a sort of a huge acute service that is more and more managing chronic stuff. And then you've got the sort of primary care hived off, and you've got social care completely separate. And that's what we've got to change it. So I think short term, what Louise is describing is right. But longer term, it's got to be, hasn't it, a rethink of how we spread all of that money through society to fund healthcare. Because at the minute, it's still all going into bricks and mortar care, isn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely. Invest more time and money into helping people like me help other people along with professionals.
That's it.
Well,
with professionals.
Absolutely. Do you know what I've written down? See, I think you'll like this. Fund the lived experience sector to help both other patients and clinicians.
Yes.
There we go.
In a nutshell.
Do you like that?
In a nutshell.
I'm getting quite good at this, turning it into.
Have you just invented the lived experience sector, or is that already a term?
Who knows? You know how my brain works.
And we're assured, Louise, that he doesn't write these before
Here's one I prepared earlier. Not.
Do you know what, Louise? I knew you and STC would get on. When you said you were picked last for teams, STC
Oh, dear. Yeah.
For the listener, I'm showing Jamie the V sign at this point.
Okay, a big thank you to Louise for joining us on the Oral Apothecary and for sharing her stories, her desert island drug, her career anthem and her book for our library. Coming up next time, we'll be joined by Professor Neil Maskery. Neil has been a general practitioner, a consultant in primary care development, a clinical editor, professor of evidence-informed decision-making, and a mentor, wise counsel and friend to many of the listeners of this podcast. We look forward to welcoming Neil next time on the Oral Apothecary. You can contact us via Twitter at Oral Apothecary. We're on LinkedIn, our website, theoralapothecary.com. You can email us at oralapothecarypod@gmail.com. Gimmo now with a final ingredient.
Okay, so thank you, Louise. That was great. And I'm lucky enough to work in the same organisation as Dr. Emma Davis. So I'll pass on that we've chatted to you, and I agree. She's fantastic. She's amazing.
She is amazing. I don't use that very lightly, but she is.
It's good use of the term. Okay, so it sort of fits in a bit with what we talked about today. I'm going to talk about the risks of positivity. So we've talked on the podcast before about the importance of empathy and compassionate healthcare, but what about the role of positivity? You might assume that positivity is a good thing and something that we should be encouraging. Well, not necessarily so, according to an article in The Guardian by one of our former guests, Professor Mark Tobert. And so Mark, if you remember, is a palliative care consultant and so often finds himself as the bearer of bad news. As a junior doctor, he often felt it was his role to offer patients a positive opinion of their prognosis. However, he describes how this often came back to bite him when things didn't quite turn out as he might have predicted. And a better, often harder approach is to balance positivity with pragmatism, realism, and sometimes even pessimism. Not an easy approach. So in the article, Mark says there's a lot of pressure to be positive these days. Some people even regard it as a form of wellness treatment in itself, and warns of the potential dangers of allowing negativity into their lives. But such enforced optimism ignores the realities of our existence. Some patients seem to think negativity will shorten their lives, but researchers in different studies have tested the hypothesis that optimism can impact survival in cancer patients and have found that it does not have an impact. In fact, in one of these studies, there was a suggestion that encouraging patients to be positive perhaps even represents an additional burden. So there we have it. As Mark says, do not be afraid to discuss potential negative outcomes with those who have put their lives in your hands, even if the news may sound terrifying. By considering the worst and the most negative scenario, we do not make it more likely that it will actually happen. Nearly everyone actually wants a healthcare professional who talks frankly, with honest compassion, outlining, realistically, what may be ahead.
This was a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough. Original music Jamie Brewster. Artwork by David Baker.
Thanks for listening to the Oral Apothecary podcast. Do not listen more than 8 times in 24 hours.
This episode of the Oral Apothecary is sponsored by onelesspill.com, a medicines optimization consultancy.